Well, hi everybody, this is Dana Childress. I want to welcome you to today's Talks on Tuesday webinar. We are delighted to be tackling a topic today that I think is some really needed information. So I work with the Integrated Training Collaborative and the Partnership for People with Disabilities at VCU, and we're happy to bring you this topic today. So the topic we're going to be addressing is about bilingual language development. So I think back from when I was a service provider, and I always had this question about how do I really know if a child is demonstrating a developmental delay when she's learning more than one language? What is typical? What should I expect? And how do I help build an IFSP and build intervention that really is appropriate for that child? So today we're going to tackle that topic in part 1 and part 2. So today's is just the first of a 2-part series. One of the great things about what we're going to talk about today is our presenter is going to share research-based information, which is always great to wrap back around and check in, make sure what we're talking about matches with our evidence. But she'll do a nice job of taking the research-based information and then translating it in a way that helps us know what do we do on our next assessment the next time we're interacting with a bilingual family. So I hope you will take the opportunity today to really reflect on your practices and think about what you know and how this can apply in your work. We invite you to use the chat tool in the lower left-hand corner, your chat box down there if you have questions or comments as we go through today. I'll be moderating the chat and trying to keep an eye on questions. Our presenter will also be keeping an eye on the chat and answering questions as we go along. So if we miss your question, don't worry. We'll have a little time at the end to catch up if we need to. Let's see. I'm trying to think any other logistics. I think that's it. So as we're going to go ahead and get started, remember that as we go through the webinar, you're welcome to ask your questions. When we get to the end, there'll be question and answer time, and then we'll wrap up by talking a little bit more about part 2, what to expect next time. All right, so let me take a moment to introduce our presenter. We are so happy to have Dr. Cynthia Corr presenting with us. Cynthia is sorry guys, my computer just went a little wacky. Cynthia is an associate professor of speech-language pathology at George Washington University. She's also been an early intervention service provider in Arlington for the past 2 years and had previously provided speech services in child care centers in Florida. Cynthia is also a member of the Integrated Training Collaborative and had offered to share her research and her insight with you guys today. And when she told me about the topic, I was super excited. Cynthia also has put together a handout for you with lots of links to good resources, including an article that she co-authored that does a really nice job of talking about myths and misconceptions related to this topic. So if that's an article you're interested in, check it out, or feel free to email me or Cynthia, and we're happy to share it. You have her email address here. I think that's it. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Cynthia. Thanks again, Cynthia, for joining us.
Hi, everyone, and thank you so much, Jeannie. Thank you so much, Dana. I hope that I can live up to that nice introduction. I'm really excited to present work around my research around bilingual language development in toddlers. This is my primary job. I'm a professor at George Washington, and my research is focused on bilingual language development. And I usually do this work in collaboration with a colleague in Florida. She's a developmental psychologist, and I'll share a link to her research lab website at the end of my talk too. So a lot of the data that I'm going to talk about today come from a project that we started together about 10 years ago. And our earlier work at that time started following young children who are learning Spanish and English at home from 22 to 30 months. And since then, we've grown our research project so that now we have data following children from 2.5 years up to 10 years, the same group of children, to learn how their early language environments can influence their academic learning and outcomes too. So this is one of the largest bilingual language development studies out there, and it's a really exciting project that I like working on. So I'm also really happy to be able to share that with you. Thank you to my friends in Arlington, Alexandria. I see you out there. Very excited to have you on today's webinar. So I'm going to go ahead and get started by saying that there are just a lot of questions. So many questions about bilingual language development, and these questions come from clinicians and they come from parents, and I hear these questions almost every day. The questions that you can see on the screen in front of you right now are the main questions that we're going to focus on in today's talk. And for the purposes of this conversation, we're going to be talking about bilingual children who hear a language other than English at home from one or both parents, and these children are sometimes referred to as simultaneous bilinguals, meaning that they hear both languages before the age of 3. So they're learning 2 languages before the age of 3 in early childhood. And most of these children in the U.S., there's a huge number of these children, and most of them are children who have one parent who immigrated from another country. And these children are often at additional risk for ongoing difficulty with learning and with academic learning in particular, because they often also come from lower income families. So they're a population that we really want to keep an eye on. So I want to start off just by kind of talking to you all a little bit to hear from you about what you think it means to be bilingual. What does bilingual mean, and what does it mean to be bilingual? And if you just go and type a word or two in your chat bar on the lower left, that will get us started. There are lots of different ideas, which is why I wanted to ask. So I see Michelle is our first responder, and she says being proficient in 2 languages. I love that Gutland Paladin says speak and understand more than 1 language, so indicating that speaking and understanding might not be the same thing. Anybody else? Oh, I love Harrison Rockingham saying being literate in both languages. That's certainly what we think of as an optimal outcome goal. And Marianne, understanding and verbalizing or using multiple languages. Yeah, so it can be a lot of different things, as we see just from the initial responses here, that we could be talking about someone who understands 1 language but speaks and understands another one, who hears both languages on a regular basis and uses both languages on a regular basis, or someone who's even a highly proficient user of both languages and is bilingual and what we call biliterate. And again, I want you to use your chat bar and just enter a comment or two, a brief comment about why do you think families are bilingual? Why are some families bilingual? How does this happen? Looks like our chat might be a little slow. Oh wow, the first 2 comments that pop up are cultures. So I think that this centers around the family. And Dana and Lisa both point out that families might move here from another country. Yes, heritage and relocation to the U.S. People come from, at least one family member comes from another country. And that's the majority of the kids that we're talking about right now. In some cases, bilingual families, as Dana points out, maybe the grandparents immigrated and the parents also speak both languages and are trying to keep a heritage language active in the home. All great answers. So I have a question, one more question for you, and this is for your chat bar, last one for right now, and that is, what do you think the top 3 languages that are spoken in your community after English? What are those? Every community differs a little bit in the languages that are spoken, so it'll be interesting to see if people show that diversity here. Patty says Amharic. Yes, Northern Virginia has a lot of Amharic and Spanish. I'm not sure where Michelle is, but she says Spanish. Spanish is the most frequently spoken in all of the United States after English. Here we go, Tagalog and French and Arabic and Spanish and Vietnamese and Korean. Northern Virginia has a lot of Korean and Vietnamese speaking families. And in other parts of Virginia, I think Central Virginia, there are more Tagalog speakers where families have immigrated from the Philippines. So yes, we can already see just from these few responses that we have quite a number of different languages. And it might surprise you to see how many languages there really are. There are more languages than are represented on this bar graph. What I'm going to show you here, yeah, I love that I'm now seeing like Kurdish in Harrisonburg, Rockingham, and Urdu, all from different parts of the state. So yes, when we look across Virginia, if we look at this little table, and we see, sorry, I'm going to try to grab my pointer clicker. I'm multitasking now. Oops. Okay. Yes, got it. So if we look on the left side, we see a list of languages. And if we look on the right side, these little numbers represent how many communities have speakers of that language in the community. So at the top, we see that Korean is used by families in 92 different communities across Virginia. And Urdu, which is one that we saw on our list, is used in 47 different communities in Virginia. And Tagalog up here is 81 different communities in Virginia. So these are all languages where there are a significant number of families speaking the language across the state. And that gives us a little bit of an idea of how diverse our communities really are. I think our tendency is to think of Spanish and English, and that's even what I'm going to focus on today. But the communities have become more diverse, and they're becoming more and more diverse. Okay, so now I'm going to throw a little true, false, or yes, no question out at you. It's like a trivia question here. And right up under your name, you have a polling option to vote yes or no. It's in the square box with a check mark right under your name. And I would like you to go ahead and respond to this question. Are children who hear more than one language, in early childhood in this case, are they delayed in learning to talk? And you can just answer the poll by clicking your response in that little box, and then we'll have Jeannie help us out by tabulating the responses. Harrisonburg, I love that you just put Tigrinya up there. I am not sure where that's spoken natively, but I love that you know that and that you are familiar with speakers of that language. Okay, so I can see the poll numbers at the top. I don't know if everyone can see that. Jeannie, if you publish that poll information, we'll see that most people think that bilingual children are delayed in learning to talk. Sorry? No, I'm sorry. Most people think that bilingual children are not delayed in learning to talk. Okay, I'm looking at two different things. But most of you said no. No is the correct answer. So children are not technically delayed in learning how to talk, but they are different than kids who are learning one language. And this is one of the big issues that we're going to be focusing on today. So the answer is no, because children are learning two languages, so their learning is divided across the two languages, and it's not focused and centered in only one language. So we have to be careful how we look at their early learning. Here's our next yes or no question, and this is, again, you can use your little checkbox up at the top right under your name to indicate yes or no. Is bilingualism confusing for young children? Yes or no? I see the answers starting to roll in. Lots of no's this time, which makes me happy. Anybody else want to pipe in? Anybody say yes, it's confusing? Well, all you people who say no are absolutely correct. Bilingualism is not confusing. But when we look at the patterns of development for a bilingual child and a monolingual child, and they're different, sometimes caregivers and well-meaning doctors and daycare providers and even speech pathologists might worry because it seems like a bilingual child knows less than a child who's learning only one language. And sometimes bilingual children mix their languages even in the same sentence, or they might use a different word order when speaking from kids who are learning only one language, and this can worry parents in particular, but also teachers and physicians. I am going to use two different scenarios today to illustrate some of the research points that I want to share with you today. And so I'm going to start off by giving you a scenario about a little girl who is really a case study of someone that I knew in a different time and place. So this, we're going to talk about Elena, who's a 26-month-old girl. So she's just over 2, and both of her parents are professors of Italian at a local college, and their family speaks only Italian at home. And Elena's exposure to English has been at her daycare, which she's attended full-time since she was 11 months old. The child care providers at that daycare say that Elena does not follow class routines very well, and she doesn't talk to other children at all. And they believe, and they've shared with the parents, that this is because she's bilingual and probably confused. So they had a consultation with the parents, a conference with the parents, and recommended that the parents speak only English at home. But these parents who speak 2 languages felt a little bit uncertain about that recommendation, so they decided to ask the pediatrician at the next visit, and the pediatrician shared with a lot of certainty that the best practice to follow is the one parent, one child, one language rule, one parent, one language rule, so that one parent should always speak one language, like Italian in this case, and the other parent should always speak English. Well, eventually this child was evaluated for a language delay by an early intervention team, and soon a speech-language pathologist began visits with the family, and the family asked her what they should do about their language choices to support their daughter's language development. And this therapist recommends that the family should just pick one language and stick with it. So now the family is really confused. And I have a couple of choices up on the screen. I'd like for you to vote, again using the same box where that little check mark was up under your name. Now there are letters there, and you can pick one of these 4 choices. So the choices are, what would you recommend for the family to do? Speak English at home? Follow the one parent, one language rule? Pick one language and stick with it? Or none of the above? And in a second I'll have Jeannie go ahead and enter your responses, and I will have Jeannie publish the results in the screen so we can all see them. I have the privilege, I don't know if everybody can see this, but I see a lot of D responses and no A, B, or C responses. Jeannie, can you publish that for us? That's what it looks like. Okay, so lots of D responses, none of the above. And now I'm seeing that Janine at Mutual Intelligence says, is having some Italian at daycare not an option? Great question, and Italian is a less spoken language, particularly in the community where this actually happened, and so no, that was not an option, unfortunately. But I think you'll see from the list of languages that we just reviewed in Virginia, and from some of the comments from our own participants, that there are enough languages spoken that having the language that the child needs available throughout the day at school is frequently not an option. And Alva says, what language does the brother speak? She's looking at the big brother in our photo. And in this case, the brother is speaking both languages, and he's able to speak English at school and Italian at home. Okay, so now I'm going to move on and share a little bit with you about what we really know from the current research. And I love the way that people are typing in with their own questions in the comment in the chat bar, and I'm going to try my best to multitask a little bit and respond to those questions as I'm going through the slides. So bear with me. If I don't get to you right away, I'll try to as quickly as I can. So I think first it helps to, these are all findings from research. So I've placed the citations for research articles below the statement on each slide, just so that you have some framework for that if you ever want to go back and read a little bit more. I would start by saying that bilingual children and monolingual children who hear only one language have really different early language learning experiences. And we know from research that this experience is what shapes their language skills. So some ways that the experiences are different is that bilingual children usually hear one of their languages from a limited number of speakers. So you can imagine that if you're speaking a more rare language at home, we can even think of the example of Elena with the Italian-speaking parents. There's not a large Italian-speaking community, so she's only going to hear Italian from her parents on a regular basis, and then maybe from grandparents as they visit, or a few family friends, as opposed to, let's pick a different language and say Spanish in South Florida, where my research was conducted, where there's a large community of Spanish speakers, and families might hear that language frequently in the community and at home. Another way that monolinguals and bilinguals differ is that many bilingual children, in fact most bilingual children, hear one of their languages from a non-native speaker of the language. So that means if I have two parents who immigrated from a Spanish-speaking country, and at home sometimes they speak English with their child, English is not the native language of those parents, and so the child is hearing English at least some of the time from non-native speakers of English. And I have some findings that I'll share from you very soon that show that that may be slightly more difficult for children to learn from than hearing English from all native speakers. And one last way that we could talk about that monolingual children and bilingual children differ that might have an effect on their language learning is that bilingual children often hear a mix of the two languages in the same conversation, like one parent using one language and one parent making comments about the conversation topic in another language, or even sometimes switching languages in the middle of a sentence, sometimes for parts of a conversation, sometimes for just a word or two within the same conversation. So all of these different experiences actually have effects on how children learn their two languages. And very closely tied to this is the idea that the quality of the language that children hear really matters, and I can't drive this point home enough. So there are several studies that make it very clear that the quality of language input that children hear has a large effect on their language skills. When parents use a richer vocabulary when they speak with their children, the children have larger vocabularies in that language. And the same is true for things like more complex sentences. So the more complex sentences that parents use, the more children are able to understand and use those complex sentences in their own language. We can think that it's maybe a little bit harder to imagine, but hearing language from many speakers of that language is actually a measure of quality of language exposure, because the more speakers that a child hears language from, the more opportunities the child has to hear a richer variety of vocabulary words and observe and hear different ways of speaking, and that really helps children learn a language. And one of the ways that this matters is that when children hear input from a native speaker, that quality is higher than the input from a non-native speaker, whether that language is English or the parent's other language. So there are a lot of questions around mixing of languages, like do we need to keep the two languages separate? Like, does one parent need to speak one language only, or do we need to try to only speak one language in the home? And again, the research is really clear. The two languages do not need to be kept separate for children to learn them both. Children who hear two languages can learn them both just fine, adequately. They have separate systems for each language. They typically don't mix the rules from one language with the rules from another language for things like word order or meanings of words or even pronunciation. And how much of each language that they learn depends on lots of different factors, the most important of which is probably how much they hear of each language, like the quantity, the number of hours a day that they hear of a language versus the other language. The other biggest factor is the quality of the language that they hear, and a final one is the opportunities that a child has to use each language. But there's no evidence to support something like the one parent, one language rule, or use a home language and let the child learn the other language at school. And we know that language mixing is real, bilingual life. There are lots of bilingual families where you can observe this, or they will tell you this information. And exposing kids to mixed input does not result in delays in development. So it's actually a sign of bilingual skill, and children are quite able to adapt to this in learning and even to use it to their benefit. Okay, the last point that I want to make before we move to a new scenario is that parents should speak to their children in the language in which they can provide the highest quality input. So this is sort of a summary of the previous slides. And this is, several studies have now shown that there's a benefit to hearing English from native speakers of English. But this could work against bilingual families because many families do not have a parent whose first language is English. But this does not mean that parents whose first language is not English should start speaking English. In fact, one of our most important findings is that when we have parents who are poor speakers of English and they decide to speak English at home with their children, this is usually because some expert has advised them to do so. We find that those children do not gain stronger English skills, but that diminishes their other home language skills. So in my own research, we have found, and I have a paper coming out in just a few months that shows very clearly when one parent is a native speaker of English, then the children's English is benefited a lot. They learn English at a faster rate than when they hear the same amount of English from non-native speakers. But the thing that's troublesome for bilingual families is that when parents whose English skills are poor are advised by well-intentioned people to speak English, that takes away time that they're talking to their child in the other language, and it may force a parent to use a lower quality of language input than they would use if they just spoke their native language. And so the best advice that we could give those parents is speak your stronger language. So kind of summing up the research points from this first scenario, we would say that the quality of language input is what really matters. And you want to be constantly providing the optimal, the highest quality of input that's possible in the home for children. Hearing language from native speakers benefits children's language skills, and exposing children to more speakers of a language benefits children. So this works both ways, this last point. If I am in a home where there are not native speakers of English, then I might look out into the community for opportunities where my child can hear English from native speakers. And on the other hand, if I'm in a home where my family speaks a language that is not widely spoken in the community, then I might work really hard to find more opportunities for my child to hear that language from more speakers of the language. So for example, right now I'm working with two families who speak Chinese at home, and even though there are a lot of Chinese-speaking families in Northern Virginia, there are not a lot of opportunities for families to have their children hear Chinese out in the community. So those families might choose to, for example, come together on the weekends and form a language community. They might seek out other cultural opportunities in the community like civic or religious organizations. Sometimes there are churches. Sometimes there are language schools that community members put together to provide those opportunities for their children. So we're constantly looking to increase the amount and the quality of input that those children get access to. And I'd like to put this into family-friendly terms for what we should be telling parents about how to support their children's language development. And the first thing that I would say is for parents to use the language that they're most comfortable using. And then just probably like most of us in early intervention work do, encourage the parents to have lots of conversations with their children, focus on taking turns back and forth in conversation and encouraging children to talk. Not to worry about whether the parents or other family members are mixing languages or whether the child is already mixing languages in early language development. One way that parents can support language development is by reading, and you can use a book to serve as a prep to talk about what you see on the page if you can't find books in print in the language that the parents are speaking at home. And you can find activities to expose children either to native English speakers if there's not a native English speaker at home, or to more members of the community who speak a language if that's a limited community. Any questions? Have a second, I can take a question or two if someone has a question. Okay, we're going to move on to another scenario. And before we start, I'd like to ask another yes/no question. So you can respond by going back up to the checkbox under your name and saying either yes or no for this question. Are toddlers like little sponges who can learn 2 languages as fast as other children learn 1 language? Yes or no? Okay, I see a little bit of a mix here this time. So far it looks like we have several yeses and a few nos. And I like Coach Lynn saying it depends on the child. Great. So we have a lot of yeses and just a few nos. The answer to this is really no. Surprisingly, most of you have yes. See the blue bar? And the reds are just the minority up there, the no's. But the answer is really no. So children, there are a few things that are true about this. One is, oh, thank you. Ginny just highlighted that no box for us. So young children do learn language really easily in early childhood through play and through daily routines, whereas adults and older children usually need some explicit instruction to learn language. But learning 2 languages in early childhood does take more time than learning 1 language. So we can't say that these children are delayed in learning per se, but they usually do have weaker language skills in each of their 2 languages than children who are learning just 1 of those 2 languages. And this is a point that can be a little bit tricky to wrap your head around in the beginning, but I'm going to keep coming back to this point that there's not an overall delay in learning language. It's not like a child who's learning one language and is slower at that overall, but you would see if you made a comparison with children who only speak 1 language that no matter which language you pick, bilingual children will look like they lag behind monolingual children a little bit. So now I have another scenario to help introduce the next research topics that I want to talk about with you. This one is going to be about a little boy named Matteo. Matteo is also just over 26 months old. He hears Spanish and English at home. This little guy was referred to early intervention for language delays by his pediatrician because he's not using 2-word phrases just yet. And the pediatrician shared with the parents that many bilingual children are delayed at first because bilingual children have language delays, and that's why he didn't refer the child earlier when they first noticed some delays. So maybe you can use the hand tool right under your name and just raise your hand if you've ever heard something like this before. Anybody ever heard anything like this? Bilingual children take longer from a pediatrician. Oh, there the hands go. I hear this very regularly even now in Northern Virginia. Yeah, so it's a pretty common misconception, I would say. But knowing that bilingual children take a little bit longer to learn each of their 2 languages than a monolingual child who is only learning 1 language, how would you decide whether Matteo qualifies for early intervention services based on a 25% delay or atypical development? And this is tricky. So this is one of the most important questions that we have. So I've got 4 choices on the screen for you, and I'd like you to use, again, the multiple response option in the far right box under your name, the little box with the letter. Should you consider only this child's Spanish skills since that's what he hears the most? Should you see if he has skills that are at age level in at least 1 language? Should you see if he has delays in both languages since that is what represents a true language problem? Or should you try to find some kind of combined measure of both languages to use since we know that bilingual children are learning the 2 languages? Go ahead and respond to that if you could. This one's pretty tricky. If you just click on that little box and pick your response, then you can publish those results. Okay, Jeannie, if you publish those, I see a trend popping up. It looks like more people have chosen either B, CFES language, age level skills in one language, or D is the majority right now. And that's try to find some kind of combined measure of both languages to use. And D is the correct answer. That we're going to look for a combined measure so that we can take advantage of knowing that children learn skills in the two languages. Okay, so what do we know right now from the current bilingual research? So right now I'm going to show you one research slide at the end of this section that focuses on bilingual children from my own study on Spanish and English bilingual children from 22 to 30 months, and also from other current research. And they all of these studies lead us to the same conclusions. Let me go ahead and start here. So there's no average bilingual child because bilingual language experiences vary widely, resulting in a range of skills in each of a child's two languages. So we can think about this a little bit like this seesaw, and that is that if I hear less English than Spanish, my skills in English are poorer than my Spanish skills, and vice versa. So for children who hear less English, we expect their English skills to be lower. But that doesn't mean that their other skills would be at age level either. So how much identifying which children have delays can be challenging because we tend to think of the average bilingual child, but in the case of bilingual children, we know that there really is no average. I'm sorry, I'm a little bit off track. Here we go. So children who learn each language, children learn each language in the same proportion that they hear each language. Children who hear more English know more English than Spanish, and children who hear more Spanish know more Spanish than English. And most bilingual children hear more of one language than the other. And how much they know depends on how much they hear across the course of a day or a week. And we measure this in something called relative proportions. So a relative proportion means if I look across an average week and I say, what % of the time does your child hear English, and someone says 80%, that means the other proportion of time they hear 20%. And again, there are very few children who hear equal amounts of each language. So we're going to return to this question. Is it typical for children who are learning two languages to lag behind children who are learning only one only one when skill level and only one language is considered? And so here we have another yes/no quiz. And based on what I just told you, do you think the answer to this question is yes or no? You can use the checkbox right under your name. So this is a little bit different from the previous question, and is it typical for children who hear two languages to lag behind monolingual children learning only one language when you just look at the skill level in that one language? So if I compare a bilingual child's English to monolingual children learning English, should I expect that the bilingual child to look like he's a little bit further behind? And if we publish that, the responses, we see that yes, the majority of you say yes, and the correct answer to this question is yes. So the reason for the lag is that language development, again, depends on language experience, and children who hear two languages, they must hear less of each language than children who only hear one language. As we like to joke around, unless they stay awake twice as long, they're hearing less of each language. And this results in lower skills in each language than monolingual children. So we can see that comparing these bilingual children to monolingual children is probably not a great idea. Because bilingual children know less of each of their languages, they take a little longer to reach language milestones in that language than monolingual children do. So you have to keep in mind that bilingual children would therefore have smaller vocabularies than a monolingual child, and that would also affect other milestones like the age at which they start combining words. Sometimes we hear children should be combining words in a language by age 2, but if they know less of their 2 languages, then they would not meet that milestone necessarily by age 2. Some bilingual children will, and some bilingual children won't. And that's what we really mean when we say there's no average bilingual child. We have to take each child case by case, depending on the language learning environment that they're living in. All of a child's language skills are going to depend on their language learning experience. Sometimes these slides aren't advancing quite in the moment that I think they should. Okay, so most bilingual children hear more of one language than the other, and their skills will be stronger in the language that they hear more of. I've said this several times now, so I hope that it makes sense and is sinking in. But the opposite is also true. So if a child hears less of one language, then we really expect that child to be weaker in that language. So given that there's going to be this kind of imbalance, how do we answer this question of whether we know a child's language skills are developing typically if there's no typical bilingual child to compare our child to? This is one of the biggest questions. How can we tell if a bilingual child has a language delay when they come to early intervention? Who should we compare them to if there are no norms for average bilingual children? And I'll just go back and say that the answer is to consider development in both languages, not just the stronger language, and to use that information. And I'm going to show you how that works now. So this is a graph from a paper that my colleagues and I published in 2012. We looked at children who were learning Spanish and English. The first time that we saw them was age 22 months, and the last time that we saw them was age 30 months. And we used vocabulary checklists to measure their vocabulary size in English and in Spanish. And we found that when we added the number of words in English plus the number of words in Spanish, the monolingual children are on this blue line, and our bilingual children are on this green dashed line. At 22 and 30 months, the children look virtually identical, the two groups of children, monolinguals and bilinguals, depending on which language, I'm sorry, let me say that again. The two groups look almost equal or practically identical when we use a total vocabulary measure for bilingual children, and that is just adding up the number of words that they say in English and in Spanish. And as we creep out to 30 months, it actually looks like bilingual children say more words overall than monolingual children. And I'd also like to direct you to the number of words that they're saying. And I think for those of us who are in early intervention practice, we're kind of shocked to hear that 22-month children say on average around 200 words. And out at 30 months that the average is up over 500 words. So this represents a range of children, but an average of 200 words is quite high. You can see Jeannie's publishing, I know, thank you Dana. It is a wow, it was wow for us as well. The resource handout link is in the login detail email, and Jeannie's very kindly provided a link in the chat right now. And that handout has resources for how to do this, and I'm going to walk you through this now. Okay, how do we determine whether a bilingual child has a delay? So, sorry, I just have to, there we go. Okay, so is everybody familiar with the ELAP? Raise your hand if you're familiar with the ELAP. It's the Early Learning Accomplishment Profile. This is an anchor tool that's widely used in early intervention. It's the tool that I use most frequently. I see a few people are raising their hands. Oh, all of my Arlington friends are raising their hands. Yeah, so the ELAP is it's a relatively short skills checklist for 7 areas of development widely used in early intervention practices across the country. It's pretty widely used in Arlington, and I'm pulling 3 examples, the only 3 examples on the ELAP that show us how many words a child should say at 3 different ages. So at 12 months, the ELAP says the child says 2 words besides mama and dada. At 21 months, the ELAP, one of the skills is that the child speaks 20 words, and at 24 months, the skill is that the child speaks 50 or more words. So you can kind of start comparing that to my chart on the previous page. So we're going to use these skills and ages to focus on how to determine a delay for the bilingual children that we might see. So the first thing to note is that this is for expressive language. This is expressive vocabulary. A child may understand, usually does understand, many more words in both languages than the number of words that they say. And so remembering that we can use a total vocabulary measure where we count the number of words the child says in one language and the number of words that the child says in the other language. If we look back at our 16-month-old example, if a bilingual child, is saying fewer than 2 words besides mama and dada in the 2 languages together at 16 months, then that's a 25% delay. And if a 28-month-old child is saying fewer than 20 words in both languages together, then that's a 25% delay. And if a 32-month-old says fewer than 50 words in both languages together, there's a 25% delay. So for very many of the children that we will assess and meet in early intervention practices, we can use this very simple measure to start helping us determine whether a child has a quantifiable delay using some kind of assessment tool like the ELAP. And I think that most assessment checklists like the ELAP or the HELP will have a number of words that are expected for a child to say at different age levels. And so you can just use that in your formula to help you out. In the handout, I have included detailed directions on how to do this. I provide you with links to the vocabulary checklists that I use to assess children in my research, and that's the MacArthur-Bates Communicative Development Inventories. And you can see that the CDI, there's a website. This is basically a free tool. You can find it free online, but you can also buy checklists, and you can buy electronic checklists if that is appealing to you. They're very inexpensive. But just having one of those checklists handy is really helpful when you're asking the parents what kinds of words a child is saying, and then you can direct them using coaching appropriate questions to find out in different contexts, like words about foods or words about routines, or there are lots of different ways to do it. And there are other word checklists I've also got included on the handout to help you count words. And so you don't really need a formal checklist in English and in Spanish or in another language, although there are checklists for other languages that you could use. So hopefully that will help everybody get started with assessing these kiddos in ASPs and in ongoing assessment in early intervention practices. So now I just want to sum up a little bit and say again, for the record, I don't think I could say it quite enough times, that bilingualism is not confusing. Children can learn 2 languages, but learning 2 languages does take a little bit longer than learning 1 language. So what should we do? We should assess a child's abilities in both of their languages. We can use Spanish language assessment tools for parent report. The ASQ is available in Spanish. I know that that's an early tool that a lot of people use, but we can use more specific word checklists to listen to a parent telling us which words and their child is saying. We can try to find out about the child's language environment, just learning as much as possible about how much of each language the child hears and from whom. This will help us determine that balance, which language a child is hearing more of throughout his week, which might help us decide what our expectations should be in terms of is one language going to be stronger than the other. We can use a total vocabulary measure. Like I said, I think there are a couple of different ways to get at that. You can use a more formal checklist like the ones on the handout. You can just interview parents really thoroughly and ask them which words their child is trying to say. There's one thing that's on the checklist that on the handout, sorry, that I do want to point out, and there are a couple of questions that come up from parents frequently, like what counts as a word, or even from clinicians and service coordinators. So these are just good reminders. What counts as a word? It's any consistent form that the child is using to attempt to say a word. And it can be something that's really close, like I think an early word that's close that we all are familiar with is something like wah-wah for water. But sometimes the kids are not very good at mapping the sounds and the words, and it could be something a lot less obvious like D for green or D for 3. And as long as the child is consistent in saying them and the parent says, oh yeah, every time he says that I know he's saying 3. He says 1, do, D, and I know that that's 3, then that counts as the word 3. But sometimes it's going to be sometimes there might be a close call with the vocabulary where you're just really not sure if that helps you make your determination. And then you do what you would always do, and that's go back and look at functional use of language and look at broader communication skills like social communication and comprehension, remembering that using expressive vocabulary isn't the only part of an assessment. So if a child is using a lot of non-functional language, and we do see that a lot in early intervention where children know letters or numbers, colors and shapes, but they're not using words to get their needs met, then that might be more of an atypical language development pattern that you could focus on. But in terms of which words children say early on, I have a nice little checklist on the handout, and it's 25 words a child should say by age 2. This is researched by Leslie Rescorla and colleagues at Bryn Mawr University outside of Philadelphia, and they're clear that across many languages, the really functional words that we all think of as early words that get things done, help, mama, up, milk, more, please, all done, that those are the words that most children, no matter which home language they speak, use. So this is a great question. What should we tell parents then? Well, I think sometimes we tend to focus on research as what we should tell parents. I know that as a researcher myself, that would be my tendency. Oh, let's tell them the research. But this is an evidence-based practice triangle that we use a lot in speech-language pathology practice, and there are 3 corners of the triangle. So the first one is research. The bottom left is clinical expertise, and this is our own experience based on what we see in the home, based on our years of clinical expertise. And the third pillar here of what we should tell parents is going to reflect the client, family, or patient values. So we're going to provide clinical expertise to tell parents how to evaluate their own children's experiences in the home. We're going to use research evidence to tell us how children learn 2 languages and what supports dual language learning. But then we have to keep coming back to the family values, and that is that children, that parents really might have concerns about how their children learn English, and that they may choose to speak English or to speak their home language or a mix, and that their choices really may change over time. We've heard lots of stories in clinical practice from parents who start off speaking one language, and when they feel like that's not really working for their child, may introduce more of the other language to support, for example, what's happening at school or English that an older sibling is using more in the home. So this really concludes my talk for today. I have planned a second part of this talk to go a little bit further in depth. Today was focused more on basics of what we need to know about bilingual language development. I hope that I've shared information for you today that's practical and provides something that you can take away with you from today's talk. When we talk again next time, which is next month, we're going to talk about children who might have more severe conditions or identified conditions like autism or Down syndrome. What about those children? We already know that they have a lot more difficulty than just a typical late talker in learning language. So should we still expose them to 2 languages? What about dealing with all these families who speak languages other than Spanish and English? There are a lot of resources for Spanish and for English, but what do we do with these families who come with minority languages in a community where there's not a large language community, and they have more concerns about either making sure that their child shares a language with them, or making sure that their child has enough English to be ready for school? What do we know about getting children ready for school when the children don't know much English? And there are going to be other topics as well, like what about the difference between receptive language, or how much a child understands versus how much a child speaks? Are all children who hear two languages going to go on to be good speakers of both languages? Do some bilingual children catch up to monolinguals? And you might have more questions of your own about how to use information on bilingual language development. I would really love to hear your questions as I get ready for the next talk. You should feel free to send me a note. I encourage you to send me a note. And my email address is there in the blue bubble. It's corr@gwu.edu. So if you have a question, please by all means send it to me, and I'll try to get back to you as quickly as possible. I have a few acknowledgments I'd like to make before I take your questions, but if you have questions, go ahead and start typing them in the chat bar now, and maybe I'll have, looks like just a few minutes to try to answer one or two. The research that I do is funded by the National Institutes of Health, by 2 grants to Erica Hoff, who's the principal investigator. She's my longtime collaborator. She's at Florida Atlantic University, which is where I used to be before moving here in 2009. You can find our research lab at this link. I'd like to thank the George Washington University because they support a lot of the time like I'm donating right now, and also my research time, and just to acknowledge those sponsors of our work. Thank you very much. I really appreciate everyone coming out today and participating in this webinar. And again, like I said, I really hope it's helpful. If you found that some things are still muddy, ask away. And if you have more questions that you feel like we're not going to get time to answer today, send me that email. I would really love to hear from you. And if you want to have a conversation, I can set up a phone time for you. I'd love to talk to you. I see a couple of questions popping up in the chat now. Michelle says, I know you said there's no typical bilingual child, but I have a lot of parents ask if there's a time that children should catch up to their monolingual peers. And this is a really great question. And the answer is complicated. It depends a little bit on what you're talking about, what kind of language, like just vocabulary. If you're talking about much more complex language, like the ability to tell a story, or if you're talking about only receptive language, like how much a child should understand. And this is one of the topics that I'm going to focus on more from my research and other research in part 2. But the short answer is it takes a good long while. It takes several years for bilingual kids to catch up on most measures. And the only measure that we really think they catch up on quickly before age 5. So if we think of bilingual kids who learn 2 languages from between birth and 3 out to age 5, by 5, almost the only area that they've caught up in is pronunciation, how well they say the sounds of their language. And Michelle hits me with another tough question. Does this include sign language as well? And I am going to admit right away that I don't have the answer to that handy right now. I don't really know. I do think that that's true for sign language, but I would love to look at that further and get back to you if you want to send me that question by email. I know some resources on that topic, and I can look up the answer to that question for you and send you the resources that I have. I'm happy to do that. Any other questions?
Well, Cynthia, as folks are wrapping up, you can keep an eye on the questions. Before everybody leaves, I just wanted to take a moment to thank you for taking your time to share your research and share your experience. I think you've answered a lot of questions people probably came in with that, you almost like, you struggle with this when you're working with families, but you don't know what the answers are. So I really appreciate your time today. I also wanted to thank Jeannie. Jeannie Schroeder's our technology specialist who does the back end and did a beautiful job with designing the slides and handling registration. So thanks, Jeannie. I wanted to let you guys know before you log off too that the webinar will be archived probably within the next couple days to a week or so on our 2008 Talks on Tuesday page on the VEIPD.org site. After the webinar today, you're going to get a survey. It should pop into your email box pretty soon. You need to take the survey to give us your feedback. We really do take your feedback seriously. And once you complete the survey, you'll have access to your certificate of participation. If you are watching the webinar in a group, or you logged in, as one person, but you're actually around the desk with a couple, just share that email with your colleagues so that they can give us feedback on their experience of the webinar and access their certificate as well. And I hope you will join us for part 2 of the webinar. That'll be on May 1st at noon. Know that when you register today, you were automatically registered for part 2, but please share the information with your colleagues. We would love to have more people join us. They can catch up by watching the archived webinar and join us in May for the live webinar. So like we said, Jeannie, thank you. She's put the link into our site if you want to know where that archive is going to be housed. And Corey put the plug out for our new VEIPD site, so take a look at that. I know it's 1 o'clock, so I'm going to revisit, make sure we don't have any more questions. I didn't see any more in here, Cynthia, so I think we're good to go. If you guys have any more, feel free to reach out to me, reach out to Cynthia. Otherwise, thanks for joining us today, and we will see you back here on May 1st. So thanks, everyone. Have a great day. Bye-bye.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.